You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda from New York City.
And this is Prashant Parmeswaran from Washington, D.C.
How are you doing today, Prashant?
Good. How are you doing?
Doing well. I'm really looking forward to this one since we have some big news to break down and analyze on the Geopolitics podcast. So last week, sort of surprising the whole world, India, out of the blue, conducted an anti-satellite test, shooting down an object in low Earth orbit. So where do you want to start?
Well, I guess the first place to start, and there's obviously various directions to take this, is kind of what the broad significance of this is, right? So Prime Minister Narendra Modi announced last week on March 27th that this test had been conducted in low orbit. And this makes India one of four countries so far that has been able to do this, the other three being the US, China, and Russia. And so there's various implications for this. One is obviously domestically the fact that we're heading into elections in India, but there's also regional and international dimensions to this as well. We've been on this podcast and talked about India-Pakistan relations and also the China angle and the dynamic as well. But I guess the first place to start is, how would you conceptualize the significance of this? Because this is obviously a very big deal, but how should we think about this in broad terms?
Yeah, so I think the first place to maybe start here is to break down anti-satellite weapons. I think that's actually kind of a misleading term to use in general. So anti-satellite is really a mission for a variety of weapons. There are co-orbital systems that the United States and the Soviet Union tested during the Cold War. There are direct energy weapons, effectively lasers, that can, and other kinds of electromagnetic weapons that can destroy or at least render satellites inoperable in orbit. And then, of course, there are kinetic direct ascent hit-to-kill interceptors. And I know that sounds like a mouthful, but that's the kind of system that India tested. And India actually, in that regard, joins a more select club than what Modi said of it being Russia, China, and the United States. It's actually just China and the United States that have used direct ascent kinetic interceptors to destroy satellites. China did it in 2007 in a highly irresponsible test that generated, more than 2,000 pieces of debris, some of which will remain in orbit for decades. It happened at a much higher altitude, over 800 kilometers over the Earth's surface, so it will take much longer for the destroyed pieces of debris to decay from that Chinese test. A year later, in 2008, the United States used a Standard Missile-3 Block 1 interceptor off of a Ticonderoga-class cruiser to take out a decaying satellite that the Bush administration said was for safety purposes, but it was really an anti-satellite demonstration after China had conducted its own test. And it sort of showed that, the core technology that we should be talking about isn't necessarily something that we would call anti-satellite weapons. It is hit-to-kill technologies. And India's, we can look at India's technology development pathway probably going back to 1999, and here's where my focus has been in the past week or so, is on the ballistic missile defense component of this, because it turns out that hit-to-kill systems, while useful for destroying satellites, are also useful for destroying ballistic missile reentry vehicles, right? So, just to briefly describe the science here, a satellite in low Earth orbit is on an orbital trajectory circling the Earth. It's effectively flying over the horizon, slowly decaying, and eventually it will return to Earth. It just takes a very, very long time for that to happen. Whereas a ballistic missile is launched on a suborbital trajectory. But at the end of the day, the task for any hit-to-kill system developer, a weapon engineer, is to develop an interceptor that can destroy one of these objects in low Earth orbit or in that level of altitude in the exoatmosphere. About 100 kilometers and above is when the exoatmosphere begins outside of the Earth's atmosphere. And the United States does this, and actually did do this last week when India did its anti-satellite test. The U.S. conducted a test of its ground-based mid-course defense system, which also operates similarly against missile reentry vehicles in the mid-course phase of flight. But so, zooming out a bit from the details and the science here, the big significance, I think, is, yes, India shot down a satellite, but is an anti-satellite capability absolutely critical for India's deterrence purposes or its warfighting purposes? Probably not. Pakistan has only ever launched 6 satellites. It's not a space power or anything. Pakistan poses terrestrial threats to India. China has commensurate capabilities of its own. Obviously, China conducted the first direct ascent test fire against a live satellite target in 2007, like I said, but also any kind of shooting war between the two countries where India, is shooting down Chinese satellites is probably one where, New Delhi's not very well positioned in general. So the military utility is kind of questionable. And the Indian rationale was really weird. They said that this was going to augment their deterrence against other countries shooting down their satellites, because then they could retaliate and punish them by shooting down their own satellites. So it's a little garbled. And so my main interpretation is that this does have implications for the development of more advanced ballistic missile defense technologies in India, because the technology sets are effectively overlapping. Anyways, I've said a lot, so I'm going to end it there, and happy to pick up on any of that as you find fit.
No, I think that's a really important point, because I think one of the aspects that's been missing from this is, as you said, I mean, a lot of this has been a focus on space and anti-satellite weapons, but the overlap between that and ballistic missile defense, as you said, I mean, has implications for the regional dynamics too. I mean, Pakistan would be, for example, very concerned about India developing a ballistic missile defense capability and what that means and portends moving forward. So it's really good that we're kind of getting into that. I guess the other part of this that's really interesting is you had a scoop up for us, an exclusive, about how actually India had conducted a previous test for this. And this was something that, that they had given a vague sense of notice to the United States and Washington with respect to what they were doing. But the implications of that was that this was something that didn't succeed previous to this test, which was actually quite successful. So maybe it'd be good to sort of talk about that perspective and to sort of tell listeners, I mean, what's significant about the fact that there were previous tests? We know of at least one that was conducted. It's not rare that you need to get a number of these in order to be successful. But what about that is significant in terms of not just what India did, but also the relationship between the United States and India, which has been one of the trends that we've been revisiting multiple times on this podcast?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to talk about that. So yeah, this is the first podcast that we're doing after we published this article in which I reported that there was a failed Indian attempt on February 12th. So the first thing I want to say is, obviously, this is literally rocket science, and shooting down a satellite, which is moving, it's moving on low Earth orbit at a speed of about Mach 28. Or sorry, not Mach 28, 28,000 kilometers per hour. So what you're looking at is you're striking this object that's moving at incredible speeds with an interceptor and using kinetic energy. So you have to collide. You're not using an explosion or anything like that to destroy it. So you have to basically, the analogy that's used in American missile defense discussions is hitting a bullet with another bullet. Mm-hmm. So the fact that India failed in the first test doesn't really, it's unexceptional, because that's simply how these things go. The United States has had failed hit-to-kill tests with missile defense systems all the time. It's a big reason why those systems come under scrutiny. But, the broader thing is that the Indian side conducted this well in advance of the proximity to the election. So this also came before all of the the major India-Pakistan crisis in February after the Pulwama terror attack that we discussed on a recent podcast, and the Indian Air Force's strikes on Pakistan and all that. So really, I think it shows that this test was not correlated to any of that. Modi's decision to announce it in a speech on March 27th obviously got a lot of criticism from the opposition, which saw it as kind of a bald-faced attempt to politicize a major technical accomplishment, take credit for it, and hope that burnishes his national security credentials ahead of the elections. I think the fact that there was a failed test on February 12th challenges that narrative a little bit. I mean, we don't know if Modi would have given a speech if it had succeeded on February 12th, but at least suggests that this program was underway. So what happened on February 12th? So according to my sources, the Indian interceptor, blew up after 30 seconds of flight, effectively. It failed to reach. So it wasn't the fact that India missed an intercept. It was the fact that the booster actually blew up shortly after flight. And it's uncertain if they used the same booster between the two tests. It's possible that, the engineers with India's Defense Research and Development Organization decided to make important changes between the two tests. We don't have enough data to substantiate that. But we do have a pretty interesting set of data in the open source that really anybody can verify, showing pretty convincingly that this was an anti-satellite test attempt, not what India's Defense Research and Development Organization put out there in press reports suggesting that the test was against an electronic target and involved simply a Prithvi defense vehicle, which is India's previously most capable known exoatmospheric interceptor to validate the ballistic missile defense capabilities of that interceptor previously. So how do we know that this was an anti-satellite test? Even not relying on unnamed sources or anything like that, we can look at the first fact, which is that India's civil aviation authorities issued a notice to airmen identifying an exclusion zone that matches exactly with the exclusion zone that India presented on March 27th when it carried out the successful anti-satellite test. So that's one important data point. And the second important data point, and I've checked this with two colleagues who are astronomers, Marco Langbrook and Jonathan McDowell at Harvard, and both of them have confirmed that Microsat R, which was the target satellite on March 27th, was in its orbit, in low Earth orbit, and was exactly above or exactly at the point where it was intercepted on March 27th, also at the time of DRDO's launch on February 12th. So in order to believe DRDO's account of events that this was a Prithvi defense vehicle that was successfully tested against an electronic target, you would have to ignore the fact that the two NOTAMs match, the two notices to airmen match, and the fact that the satellite was exactly in the position during the launch where it was during the eventual successful intercept. So I think that's pretty difficult to write off.
Right.
As far as the U.S.-India relationship goes, so what was interesting, so the sources that I cited in the article are within the U.S. government and are well acquainted with the military intelligence assessments that went into this Indian anti-satellite test eventually, and the failed test on February 12th. And what they told me was that there was some kind of vague, quote-unquote vague, Indian notification before the test occurred. It seemed to me that the Indian side did not clarify that it was conducting an anti-satellite test, but Washington knew that something interesting was about to happen. So it's unclear how closely the United States observed the first test in February, but what's interesting is that we know that the United States Air Force deployed its Cobra Ball aircraft, which monitors ballistic missile tests and space events in general, to the Indian Ocean to monitor the second Indian test, the successful anti-satellite test. So the U.S. probably got a very good look at the new the new interceptor that India did successfully test on March 27th. But I think, on a strategic level, I think it speaks to maybe the changing nature of relations between the two sides, between New Delhi and Washington. And, depending on what data point you want to focus on, yes, India did give Washington a heads up, but it wasn't specific to the point of acknowledging that this was a low Earth orbit anti-satellite test. And of course, the U.S. statement that came out after the test was interesting. It sort of, I think, was perceived by at least a few commentators in India as a very positive statement. I didn't read it that way because the U.S. did acknowledge that it was very concerned about space debris, which is obviously a major threat with any kind of kinetic low Earth orbit anti-satellite test, right? Obviously, India avoided the kind of criticism that came with China's 2007 test, but we're still waiting to see what kind of debris was produced. I think just earlier today, before we started recording, the NASA administrator clarified that some objects had been launched to a higher orbit after the kinetic intercept and will remain there for much longer. India originally said that its calculations had shown that all the debris would vanish in 45 days, which sounded pretty incredible to me. But I think the precedence there is probably the 2008 test, which was at the 2008 U.S. test, which occurred at a similar altitude to the Indian test, and most of that debris disappeared in a matter of months, and some pieces that got ejected to higher altitudes were finally destroyed after 2 years when they decayed in orbit and burnt up in the atmosphere.
Right. I mean, and I think you're getting at really the other piece of this conversation that's really important, which is, there's been this ongoing conversation about avoiding the weaponization and sort of an arms race in outer space over the past few years. And part of that conversation is about, as you mentioned, space debris and the international implications of these tests that are conducted by individual countries. But it's also, I mean, the fact that India has now entered the fray as one of several countries that have this capability. What does this tell us about ongoing efforts to prevent or at least manage some of these concerns with respect to outer space. I mean, we know there have been efforts by the European Union, by the United Nations, to try to develop some norms around how we can all sort of manage the space. But is this something that is quite concerning, or suggests that this effort is most likely to be quite futile, or is there an opportunity, perhaps? I mean, some people have been arguing this, including in India, that India should now actually use this opportunity that it's entered the fray to actually play a more proactive role in terms of trying to develop these norms. I mean, how should we think about that?
Yeah, I mean, so, I'll start with your question backwards because I think there is absolutely that perception in India that if India had not conducted this test and there had been a future international regime to develop norms around anti-satellite testing, India wouldn't have had a seat at the table. And the experience that informs that is obviously India's sort of peculiar history with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. New Delhi obviously criticizes that treaty on philosophical grounds as creating sort of two classes of states, the nuclear haves and have-nots, and India exists as a nuclear power entirely outside of the NPT regime, never having signed the treaty, much less ratified it. So there is that experience for India that I think informs a lot of the discussion around this anti-satellite test. So I wrote a piece today for the Washington Post taking a stab at this question because you're absolutely right that norms against anti-satellite testing are fraying, and I think India's test is, I think demonstrates that pretty well. Obviously, that's not to say India is to blame, because if you ask sort of, or if you read public statements made by Indian political leaders and scientists with the Defense Research and Development Organization, many of them have cited China's 2007 test. So it's the idea that, proliferation begets proliferation. China was a newcomer back then to the field of direct ascent, hit-to-kill technologies, and it's honed those technologies. Last year, it had a successful test against a medium-range ballistic missile target. And, Beijing's just gotten a lot more proficient. And now India's entering the fray. And this is where I think we start to see this really taking off outside of the realm of the superpowers, because in the Cold War, anti-satellite weaponry was restricted to the Soviet Union and the United States. The U.S. shot down a satellite in 1985, and the Soviets, like I said, conducted a range of co-orbital interceptor tests. But right now, I think what we're seeing is that this kind of technology is no longer restricted to the superpowers, and it will spread. I mean, Japan is acquiring SM-3 Block 2As for Aegis Ashore, co-developing that with the United States. Israel and the United States are developing similar technologies together. There are other countries with latent indigenous ballistic missile defense programs that could break out to an anti-satellite capability. South Korea comes to mind here, potentially Taiwan. Even actually potentially, North Korea, if it really wanted to develop an exo-atmospheric anti-satellite interceptor, might be able to do so under very specific circumstances. So I think, this is a major challenge, and I think it's a little bit too late now to develop a non-binding or binding regime that would completely ban anti-satellite tests, which is kind of what most spacefaring private firms and space policy professionals recommend as the ideal solution to this, because it really is the tragedy of the commons. Space isn't, space is the ultimate commons in a way. You cannot, anytime anybody carries out an anti-satellite test, first of all, it's impossible to perfectly model the nature of the debris events that occur when the kinetic interceptor meets the intended satellite target. So you will always have unpredictability. I think the NASA administrator today said that some of the Indian debris has ended up at an altitude higher than the orbit of the International Space Station, which could in the future pose risks to the space station. And of course, if God forbid, there is some kind of accident where debris created by this Indian anti-satellite test causes harm to the ISS, obviously you can see India's reputation as a spacefaring country taking a hit. And I think some of that has already happened, right? Something that's interesting is that Planet Labs, which is a company that does daily satellite imaging of Earth and has actually used India's ISRO, the Indian Space Research Organization's launchers to launch its payloads, and actually launched a payload just yesterday using an Indian satellite, put out a statement last week after the anti-satellite test criticizing New Delhi for the test. So there are these considerations, and I'm not sure what the right answer is here. What I proposed in my article for the Washington Post was that we could potentially think about formalizing an anti-satellite testing norm at, up to certain altitudes. 200 kilometers and lower would be way more preferable than 300, which is what the Indian announced altitude was. It was more like 282 kilometers. But, that's not good enough, because if we do codify something like that, it could create perverse incentives for countries to develop interceptors to take out satellites at that altitude. For them to be militarily useful, though, they would need to be capable of striking targets at higher altitudes. But once you tweak your software, tweak your interceptor, and you take out a target at 200 kilometers, scaling that up to higher altitudes is less of a complicated task than it would be before that test. But obviously, we don't want anybody to start thinking about taking out satellites at geostationary orbits, which are significantly further away.
Yeah.
It's a tough problem. And I think for India, we shouldn't underplay the fact that the way Modi presented this to the Indian people in his national address really emphasized sort of India's entrance into a club. It was very kind of prestige driven. India is now among these countries. It's a space superpower. So it really, does kind of play into that sense, or that broader conversation about India's rise. And so I think, it'll be a difficult problem to deal with. And New Delhi has actually been quite, at least before this test, was quite, cold to efforts, primarily by the European Union after the Chinese 2007 test, to create some kind of non-binding international norms. So we'll have to see if that changes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, just an additional point to underscore what you said before we close, there is this ongoing debate, and we've seen that with nuclear weapons, and now we're seeing it with space as well, which is that, there's this ongoing conversation basically that boils down to, is it specific capabilities themselves that are the problem, or is it, who has them? That's the issue.
That's right.
And I think, and there's never really a very easy answer to that question, because I think it's often presented as one or the other. But irrespective of what the United States does or what India does, Beijing will have its own complaints about how norms are a facade for self-interest and geopolitics, and there'll be other countries who will argue that, well, Beijing is engaging in this, so we have no choice but to actually realize our own self-interest even as we're pursuing these norms. So it's you can never have it both ways. So
yeah, no, I think that's a good note to maybe end on. And I think that's been India's kind of MO on its nuclear weapons program. Obviously, it has managed to secure a very unique position for itself, where India has received a waiver from the Nuclear Suppliers Group, pretty much participates in most forms of ordinary nuclear commerce at increasing levels today, since its 1998 tests, and that's only going to improve. And that's partly because the United States sees India, the world's largest democracy, as an important factor in geopolitically balancing China. And so I think the American reaction to the anti-satellite test also speaks to that. And of course, we are seeing India kind of make the most of that as well. So yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think that's a good note to end on the Geopolitics podcast. Well, Prashant, thanks for joining me.
Good to be with you.
Yeah, and thanks for letting me ramble. I felt like I talked for most of this, but hopefully it wasn't too bad. All right. Well, for our listeners, thanks as always for tuning into the podcast. If you like what you heard, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you've been a subscriber for a while but you haven't yet left us a review on either iTunes or Google Play, please go ahead and do that. It really helps get the word out about the show. So thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back next week with more.